Why do labor laws exist? Well, I think labor laws exist, as I said, they really came about, and I'll include employment law protections along with labor laws, but there were no exceptions to the employment at will doctrine until the late 1890s, early 20th century. And the event that really is kind of credited with creating all of this was the shirtwaist factory fire in New York, in Soho, in the early 1900s. I think somewhere around 1907, I think. And what happened was there was this large, if you think of a New York building, about 10 or 12 stories, open, and it was a place where they made shirts. And there were lots of workers, mainly women, young women and children, some men, but predominantly women, that were the seamstresses in this shirt factory. And it was a common practice for landlords and factory owners to seal the building. And they did that by nailing shut the windows, and most windows, and the fire escapes. And the reason they did that is they didn't want the workers going out onto the fire escape to smoke cigarettes, to literally take a smoking break or to take any kind of breaks. And so a fire started in this particular factory. The workers could not get out. The stairwell was engaged early, and hundreds of people died in that fire. And there was literally no recourse that those people had for against anybody for those deaths. There was no OSHA, there was no tort liability, there was no workers' comp. And that created a backlash that kind of came along with the antitrust and muckraking movement, progressive movement in the United States. Theodore Roosevelt is well known as being part of that. And so that started movements within the states and within the Congress to implement child labor laws, implement workplace safety laws, and the labor laws, the union laws, came about during the 20s and 30s, predominantly during the Great Depression, when there was a need to regulate labor unions and the way that corporations dealt with labor unions. There was a lot of violence involved with striking and union busting and so forth. And so once the Industrial Revolution really got some steam, if you will, in the 20s and 30s, there was just a public perception of a need to constrain employers and the corporate overreaching of employees. And there was a sentiment that the bargaining positions between employees and employers, particularly in non-union settings, was so out of whack that that there needed to be some leveling of that playing field, particularly in response to the Great Depression. And so the Great Depression is when the Age Discrimination and Employment Act was first passed, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which again is overtime and minimum wage. And those were enacted along with Social Security to support older folks, to make sure that older people weren't being discarded from the workforce, and to make sure that there was a penalty for working people overtime. And the thought was that if it costs more for someone to work more than 40 hours, that would create jobs, that employers would rather have the added productivity of a second position at straight time rather than paying time and a half to one worker. So all of that was in response to the Great Depression. And then as you go through the 20th century, each one of the reactions, whether it was the Civil Rights Act or the Family Medical Leave Act, Americans with Disabilities Act, were all political reactions to societal problems and a way to address them. So that's how most of the employment laws evolved. They also evolved through common law development, and there were lots of common law decisions by courts, state courts and federal courts, that created some common law causes of action that really, by and large, later were codified by legislatures. Although there's some, for example, in Tennessee, there's still some common law anti-retaliation provisions for workers' comp and for whistleblowing and for jury duty. So those still are among us. And I would say the bottom line answer is these laws were enacted to address problems in society as part of the progressive movement of the 20th century.